Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this JCRC Israel briefing on the new Israeli government. My name is Eli Cohn-Postell. I am the Director of Israel Engagement at the JCRC of Greater Boston. It's June 17th today. I'm recording this. If you have any further questions after watching this briefing, I invite you to be in touch. We're going to talk a little bit today about the new Israeli coalition that was sworn in this past Sunday. The new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, and alternate Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid. This marks the first time since 2009 that there has been a prime minister in Israel other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who, between his two terms, is the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. So, there's a significant shift in terms of the political culture. We'll talk a little bit about what this might mean in terms of political changes as well. I want to talk about three questions today, three questions that I hope I can answer. One is, who is in the coalition? What are the parties and who are the significant individuals? Two is, what changed from the previous elections that led to this coalition? So this was the fourth Israeli election in 2 years, and the first time that the group of parties not led by Benjamin Netanyahu has been able to form a coalition successfully. So what changed that enabled that? And what can we expect to change politically with this coalition, or what might we expect from them in terms of the direction they go? A lot has been said about Naftali Bennett in particular and being from a very right-wing party. So we'll talk a little bit about what to expect from him and from others in the coalition and talk about the balance that needs to be struck for this to work. So a brief reminder before we dive in about how the Israeli political system works, and I'll just go over this very quickly. But first is that as opposed to American elections, in Israel, you vote for a party, not a person. So nobody went to the polls in March in Israel and voted for Naftali Bennett. They voted for his Yamina party. And in fact, this sort of answers the question that I just posed about Prime Minister Bennett. Not that many people relatively voted for the Yamina party. And yet he's prime minister. So we'll talk a little bit about how something like that happens, but you vote for the party, not for the individual. Second is that there are no districts in Israel. There's a single national election. So everybody goes to the polls on one day and votes for their preferred party. And then based on who those people vote for, there's proportional representation amongst the 120 seats of the Knesset. So if your party gets 4% of the votes, that translates to about 4 seats in the Knesset, and then you can go up from there, depending proportionally on how your party does. So we'll talk a little bit about how the parties that formed the coalition performed in the election, and how some of the parties outside of the coalition performed during the election, because those are interesting questions. It's one of the cases in Israeli history, and actually an earlier term of Prime Minister Netanyahu's was similar, where the party that does not have the largest amount of seats or the largest representation in Knesset is actually the party that was able to negotiate the formation of a coalition. So you don't need to win the majority or the plurality of seats in order to form a coalition. What you need to do is in order to become prime minister, what you need to do is to form a coalition of 61 or more of those 120 seats in the Knesset. And that's what Yair Lapid, the head of the Yesh Atid party, was able to do. So let's talk about the coalition itself, who is in and who is out. In total, 8 parties are signed coalition agreements. So there was the agreement was negotiated, or the coalition was negotiated by Yesh Atid and their chairperson Yair Lapid. He and his party won only 17 of the 120 seats in the Knesset. Okay, and actually, the next biggest party is not even the party of Naftali Bennett that's in the coalition. The next biggest party won 8 seats in the coalition in the Knesset. And that party is the Blue and White Party, led by Benny Gantz, who was the alternate prime minister in the previous election. He had a party that ran for the first time in the previous election, won about 30 seats. He worked with Prime Minister Netanyahu to negotiate a unity government. That was not very popular among his voters. And during this election, he received 8 seats, which is still enough to make him the second largest party in the coalition. Next, we have a few different parties that came in at 7 seats. First, we have Naftali Bennett and the Yamina party. Yamina means rightward. We have Merav Michaeli and the Labor Party. She's the only female head of a party as part of the coalition. And we have Avigdor Lieberman of the Yisrael Beitenu, or Israel is Our Home party, also winning 7 seats. So 3 parties with 7 seats. And one of them, Naftali Bennett, was able to negotiate a deal that makes him prime minister for the first year and a half of this, the coalition agreement. 3 more parties. There's the New Hope Party, led by a man named Gideon Sa'ar, and they won 6 seats. That's a new party this time. After a previous round of elections, Gideon Sa'ar, who had been a member of Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, and he had challenged Prime Minister Netanyahu to a primary for the leadership of the Likud party. And after losing to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he started his own party called New Hope. This was their first election. They won 6 seats. And then we have a party a little farther to the left called the Meretz Party, led by a man named Nitzan Horowitz. They won 6 seats. And then we have the Ram Party, which is an Islamist Arab party led by Mansour Abbas, that won 4 seats. And we'll talk about this more, but it's not a small deal. It's a very big deal. Ram is the first predominantly Arab party in the history of Israel to sign a coalition agreement. There was one time previously in the 1990s during the Oslo era that an Arab party supported the government, supported the Rabin government during the Oslo process, but didn't actually ever formally join a government or join a governing coalition. This is the first time in history that's happened. So obviously there's a lot of significance to that. But I want to take a minute to step back because now we've sort of named who the 8 parties are and how they got to their just over 60 seat majority. There's 61 seats. How weird is it for this group of people to be sitting together? And how much each party and the heads of these parties had to give up to make this coalition agreement work. So let's just talk right off the top. You have Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who heads a party that's literally called Rightward, a religious nationalist party. Bennett, someone who worked for Prime Minister Netanyahu in the past, who's a former head of the former spokesperson of the organization that speaks on behalf of the Jewish communities that live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And he's sitting in a coalition with Merav Michaeli and Nitzan Horowitz, the heads of the Labor and Meretz party, respectively, traditional liberals in the peace camp, a woman and a gay man. And those liberals have decided, the secular liberals have decided not only to sit with Naftali Bennett and the Yamina party, but also with Mansour Abbas, with an Islamist party. And Islamism and secular liberalism are not exactly what I think of. I think what a lot of us think of as political bedfellows a lot of the times. The first Arab party in history to sign a coalition agreement, the Ram Party and Mansour Abbas. And he's sitting in a coalition with all of these parties and also with Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid and Avigdor Lieberman of Yisrael Beitenu, secular parties with primarily economic priorities who want more regulation on the ultra-Orthodox communities. And that's not even all of the parties, but those are all of these people who have come to sit together, and a little bit of what they had to grapple with and the balance that they had to strike between the interests of their voters and their specific party members and those of the country as they put this coalition together. I think that's really the remarkable story here. There's a lot being said, and rightfully so, about how much this is about Benjamin Netanyahu, about how much these parties were able to come together as a way of ousting Netanyahu from power. And there's, certainly an element of truth to that. But as always, there's much more at play and much more complexity here than just that storyline. And a lot of political courage on behalf of a lot of people that make something like this happen. So with who's in, I want to talk just very briefly about who's out. One, obviously, is Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party. He will lead the opposition. The Likud party had 30 of the 120 seats of the Knesset, and has 30 of the 120 seats in the Knesset, and that's what they won in the March election. So you see that Netanyahu with 30 seats had the first opportunity to negotiate and form a government, and he was unable to. And Lapid, with only 17, took over and was able to put the coalition together. And the other party, the significant party I think that's out, or that I think is going to at least help explain a little bit of how things might change politically, in some ways, is the ultra-Orthodox parties. So the ultra-Orthodox Jewish parties, there are 3 of them. are not in the current governing coalition, and that has significant implications, at least for some things within Israeli society that we'll talk about very shortly. Um, okay, so that's question number one: who's in the coalition and who's out of the coalition? Question number two is what changed from the previous elections that allowed this to happen, or that allowed this coalition to be formed. So a lot of people, myself included, were very skeptical after the election in March that there would be a coalition. A lot of people expected Israel to head to a fifth election. The thinking was that this would have to be, in essence, the exact coalition that Yair Lapid would have to form. It's a razor-thin coalition with barely 61, 62 seats in the government at most. And you have to bring together this incredible ideological diversity, this incredible breadth of the Israeli citizenship in order to make this happen. So there's a lot of doubt that something like this would take place. There was even doubt about whether at some point he would get the mandate or whether the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin, would simply give the mandate back to the Knesset and back to the people to go to another round of elections. But Lapid did receive the mandate, and the first thing that was significant was instantly his willingness to cede being prime minister first in any negotiation agreement, which obviously, this is politics. There are a lot of prideful figures. There are big egos. The idea of starting out by putting yourself aside and showing a willingness to negotiate in exchange for other priorities. In Lapid's case, it was control of the foreign ministry and extensive control over the foreign ministry. And the title of alternate prime minister. He'll become prime minister a year and a half into the coalition agreement when Prime Minister Bennett's term ends. But his willingness to cede the prime ministership or the head of the prime ministership, at least in title, at least at the beginning of the coalition process, I think was significant. Bennett expressed a willingness, I think, for not necessarily the first time, but a willingness to sit with the center parties, with the left parties, and with the Arab parties in order to become prime minister. He apologized to Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ram party, for offensive comments they had made about him in the past. He's sitting with people who deeply oppose his worldview in order to be prime minister. It would, there's ideologically, it makes much more sense for Naftali Bennett to be sitting with Benjamin Netanyahu in the Likud party. So his willingness to feel that it was not in his interests and not in the country's interests for him to do that was in and of itself a bold choice. And for me, the big story again is Mansour Abbas and the Ram party. So a couple of things happened leading up to this election that are very significant here. One is that for the past few elections in Israel, the four predominantly Arab parties had been running as a single election block, or in some cases, two blocks of two. And that was really helping to unify the Arab vote in Israel. In one case, to even make the Joint Arab List the second largest party in the Knesset. And that changed before this election because Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ram party, the Islamist party, separated his party from the Joint List. So there are actually two right now, predominantly Arab parties in the Knesset. There's Ram, the Islamist party led by Mansour Abbas, which joined the coalition, and there's the United Arab List, which sits in the opposition. And splitting off from the Joint Arab List was significant because the Joint Arab List, the United Arab List, has been willing to negotiate primarily with the left in Israeli politics, but has not shown a willingness to negotiate with the right of Jewish Israeli politics. And Mansour Abbas showed early on a willingness to negotiate with the right and the left. He was willing to negotiate with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he had the mandate to form a government, and he was willing to negotiate with Lapid, the other left parties, Bennett and the right-wing parties. And this created an interesting dynamic where there was, in essence, a bidding war for an Arab party to join the coalition, which would have been unheard of in Israeli politics really not long ago. As a result, Mansour Abbas was able to win real concessions for the Arab community. First, there's going to be recognition of Bedouin villages in the south of Israel. So a lot of Bedouin communities live in what are currently unrecognized villages, and they're therefore subject to demolition at times and other things, but that will not be the case for 3 of these villages that are set to be recognized within the first think it's 45 days of the coalition agreement being signed. There's funding for a crime prevention initiative in the Arab community that's been pushed a lot by our partners at Boston Partners for Peace at the Abraham Initiative. So we've done a lot of work on helping the government develop plans to fight crime, to fight an epidemic of crime in Israeli Arab communities. There's going to be increased funding directly to Arab municipalities. And he also didn't take a role as a minister in the government. So he signed the coalition agreement, but he's not a minister. So he's, like everyone else, he's finding the balance between, getting concessions for his community, not sort of crossing too far red lines that haven't been crossed before, even as he's even as he's breaking new ground. I'm trying to find the balance of not going too far in a way that would alienate his voters. And still, there's, when we talk about this, there's a lot of complexity there. This is not a man who's supported by all Arab citizens. Again, this is a religious fundamentalist party. It's an anti-LGBTQ party. It's not a party that's supported by, primarily by secular Arab citizens. So it's just all of it is very interesting. But Mansour Abbas's willingness to negotiate with the right and the left really created a different dynamic in terms of how the whole negotiation played out. So what can we expect to change? Or what can we expect some of the politics of this government to be? I think there's only going to be, because of the breadth of the coalition, there's only going to be significant movement on issues where there's broad consensus. So one thing that's been discussed is creating term limits for the prime minister, creating an 8-year term limit on an Israeli prime minister. Another thing that's been discussed, there was a terrible tragedy on Mount Meron in the north of Israel about a month ago now, where at a religious festival, there was a stampede and about 40 ultra-Orthodox men died as a result of this stampede. And that there will be a commission formed to investigate that. I know it seems like that would be obvious, but the ultra-Orthodox parties, if they were in the coalition, would have blocked that inquiry from being formed. So the fact that that is an issue of broad national consensus, that there should be an investigation into what happened there so that there could be improved conditions in the future. There'll be some changes to representation in religious courts, both because Mansour Abbas, as an Islamist, will make changes to the Sharia courts in Israel, and also because Naftali Bennett, as head of a religious nationalist party as opposed to an ultra-Orthodox party, will make changes internally to the religious courts. There'll be recognition of different streams of American Judaism, which is exciting for a lot of American Jews, as well as implementation of a plan to develop an egalitarian prayer space at the Western Wall where men and women can pray together and all people can pray together. There's already been a change because Nitzan Horowitz, who I mentioned as the head of Meretz, he's the first gay minister in Israel's history, and he's the minister of health, and he has already created a change that will allow gay men to donate blood in Israel. So, on some issues there will be change, but, again, these are issues that generally are consensus issues, and they're not particularly controversial. We're not talking about settlement growth. We're not talking about peace agreements with the Palestinians. We're not talking about, there's a lot that we could, we're not talking about criminal investigations into opposing politicians or anything like that. We're talking about things where there's already broad consensus within the country and within this, greatly diverse set of parties that have formed the new government in Israel. In terms of the conflict, I think there is hope among people that there will be an approach to minimizing the conflict. And for folks who read Micha Goodman's book Catch 67 that came out a few years ago, and if you have not read Catch 67 by Micha Goodman, I highly recommend it. But his thesis in that book, or his approach in that book to how Israel should handle the conflict, is to try to take any steps possible to minimize, build little steps of trust, little pieces of trust to build off of, so that there's just better conditions for everybody, first of all, but also so that we can start building towards a peace agreement of some kind, which I think we've been saying for a while, feels very far away, and it's something that we need to be building towards. So I think, what does that look like in practice? There are already a couple of indications. So Tuesday, there was a delayed, what had been delayed, but what's called the Flag March in Israel, which is, was one of the preceding events that led to the recent round of violence between Israel and Hamas. Um, but the flag march took place on Tuesday, and instead of launching rockets out of Gaza, there were incendiary balloons that were launched out of Gaza into Israel. And while that's a clear violation, the response from Israel has been very muted, as opposed to what we saw a month ago. There have been changes to some defense policies already, especially in terms of intrusions into homes in the West Bank in nighttime, and just kind of minimizing the presence of the Israeli army in Palestinian communities in the West Bank. Mentioned already, but funding for Arab citizens of Israel, the recognition of the Bedouin villages. Part of the coalition negotiations involved talking about changes to laws, to demolition laws, and to laws that enable the Israeli government to demolish homes that are being built without permits. And that didn't happen as part of this negotiation, but like you can see a situation where an Arab party in the future might be able to include that in a future coalition agreement, which is not something that we would have said a few weeks ago. And most importantly, the recognition amongst the Israeli public that and the Palestinian public that any of these steps can be taken without the delicate balance, but that holds the status quo between Israelis and Palestinians falling apart completely, and the recognition that there are things that can be done to minimize the conflict, that there are rights that can be granted, that there are changes that can be made that don't make the entire project of a Jewish and democratic state fall apart. And so that's very encouraging. And then finally, the last thing that I want to say just before finishing is, and we're already seeing this too, but just a change in the discourse and a change in how politics is done. For all of these people who joined the coalition, for all of the parties who joined the coalition, taking the risk of alienating their own voters, taking the risk of ceding some of their main priorities in order to put the good of the country ahead of their own individual good and the good of their parties. It's very significant. It's not something that we see a lot in politics these days, and it's something that should really be celebrated. There are also individual cases. Naftali Bennett, as a religious individual, was getting a lot of criticism from the ultra-Orthodox parties in particular, but handled himself, I think very well and with a lot of grace. Similarly, Yair Lapid has really handled himself well in dealing with the internal Israeli political dynamics, as well as in his early days as foreign minister, talking about resetting the bipartisan relationship in Israel, between Israel and the United States, resetting the relationship with Democrats in America, and with other parts of the world, and really sort of trying to turn a new page and imagine a new future, where Prime Minister Netanyahu is not the prime minister. Which it's, again, 12 years is a very long time. It's a political change, a political generation. So there's a lot of speculation about where this government might head, how long it might last, based on sort of the breadth involved and the difficulty of holding such a narrow line. But there's also a lot to be encouraged about, and I guess that's the message that I will leave you with today. So thank you for tuning in. And again, if you have any questions following this briefing, please feel free to be in touch.